There's a moment in many relationships that feels confusing, quiet, and strangely heavy. It's the moment when both of you stop reaching out. No texts, no calls, no small attempts to keep the connection alive. At first, it may feel like a simple pause. Maybe you're waiting to see if they'll message first. Maybe they're doing the exact same thing. And suddenly days pass, sometimes weeks, with nothing but silence between two people who once spoke so easily. This moment can feel uncomfortable because it forces you to confront something deeper than words, the truth of the connection. When both people stop reaching out, it isn't just about being busy or distracted. It often reveals what each person is truly willing to do for the relationship. And the reality is, silence in relationships is rarely empty. It carries meaning. It shows hesitation, pride, fear, and sometimes fading interest. When both of you stop reaching out, it often means the connection has entered a quiet test. Each person is waiting for the other to show effort, waiting for proof that they matter enough to be pursued. But here's the deeper truth. Healthy connections rarely survive on silent standoffs. When two people genuinely value the bond, someone eventually breaks the silence, not because they lost the game, but because the relationship matters more than pride. Sometimes the silence reveals something painful but important. It shows that the connection was being carried mostly by effort from one side. And when that effort disappears, so does the communication. Other times, the silence is simply two people protecting themselves from rejection, each one hoping the other will move first. But relationships cannot grow inside unspoken expectations. They grow through clarity, honesty, and the courage to reach out, even when it feels vulnerable. So when both of you stop reaching out, don't just see the silence as an ending, see it as information. It's showing you what the connection truly is, without the noise. And sometimes, the quiet tells the truth that words never could. Silence in a relationship is rarely empty. In fact, it often communicates more than words ever could. When two people stop reaching out to each other, it might look like nothing is happening on the surface, but emotionally, a lot is being expressed. Silence can reveal hesitation, disappointment, pride, confusion, or even a quiet withdrawal that neither person has openly admitted yet. Many people assume communication only happens through messages, calls, or conversations. But the absence of those things is also a form of communication. When someone who once checked in regularly suddenly goes quiet, that change itself sends a message. Often silence appears when emotions become complicated. One person might feel unsure about where they stand, so they step back slightly to see what the other person will do. Instead of directly asking for reassurance, they create distance and observe. If the other person reaches out, it feels like confirmation that the connection still matters. But if the silence continues, doubt begins to grow. The longer the quiet lasts, the more each person starts interpreting it in their own way. One person may think, if I mattered, they would have texted. Meanwhile, the other person might be thinking the exact same thing. This is why silence can become so powerful. It turns into a silent conversation filled with assumptions. Each person is responding to what they believe the silence means rather than what the other person actually feels. And because no one is saying anything directly, misunderstandings start building in the background. Two people who might still care about each other can slowly drift apart simply because neither of them spoke up. Silence can also reflect emotional self-protection. Sometimes people pull back because they are afraid of appearing too invested. They worry that reaching out first might make them look needy or vulnerable. So instead of expressing their feelings openly, they stay quiet and wait. In their mind, silence feels safer than risking rejection. But when both people choose safety over honesty, the connection ends up trapped in a standstill. Another reason silence carries meaning is because effort in relationships is usually visible. When someone wants to maintain a connection, they typically show it through small actions, a message to check in, a simple question about your day, or even a short conversation that keeps the bond alive. When those efforts disappear, it often signals a shift in emotional energy. It doesn't always mean someone stopped caring completely, but it does suggest that something has changed in how they are approaching the relationship. Silence can also act like a mirror. It reflects the real level of investment between two people. If one person has been carrying most of the communication, their absence can suddenly reveal the imbalance. The quiet exposes who was truly driving the connection forward and who was simply responding to it. This is why silence should never be dismissed as meaningless. It is a signal that something within the dynamic has shifted. It might be uncertainty, fear, pride, or emotional distance. But whatever the reason, silence always tells a story about what both people are feeling and what they are choosing not to say out loud. One of the most common reasons two people stop reaching out to each other is not a lack of feeling, but the quiet presence of ego. Ego in relationships often shows up in subtle ways. It whispers ideas that sound reasonable on the surface, but slowly create distance between two people. It says things like, if they cared enough, they would text first, or I already reached out last time, now it's their turn. What starts as a small moment of pride can slowly turn into a silent competition where both people are waiting for the other to make the next move. The problem with ego is that it shifts the focus away from connection and places it on control. Instead of asking, what would help this relationship grow? The mind starts asking, who has the upper hand right now? In that moment, communication becomes less about genuine interest and more about protecting pride. A simple message that could reopen the connection suddenly feels like losing a game that no one ever agreed to play. This silent standoff can be especially confusing because both people may still care deeply about each other. Their feelings might not have disappeared at all. The hesitation comes from a fear of appearing too eager or too invested. Many people worry that if they reach out first, they will look like the one who cares more. So they hold back, hoping the other person will step forward and prove their interest. But when two people are both listening to that voice of pride, the same pattern repeats on both sides. Each person waits. Each person watches the silence grow. And with every passing day, it becomes harder to break that quiet because the gap feels larger than it did before. What could have been solved with a simple message becomes a long period of distance filled with assumptions. Ego also creates a misunderstanding about effort in relationships. Some people begin to believe that the person who reaches out first is somehow weaker or less valued. In reality, the opposite is often true. The person willing to break the silence is usually the one who values the connection enough to move past pride. They understand that relationships are not built through scorekeeping, but through consistent effort and emotional openness. When ego takes control, communication becomes conditional. Someone might think, I'll only reach out if they do it first. The connection then depends on rules that were never spoken aloud. These invisible rules create pressure and confusion because the other person may not even know they exist. Instead of two people expressing interest freely, both are quietly measuring each other's actions. Over time, this mindset can weaken even strong connections. Genuine relationships thrive on warmth, curiosity, and small, consistent efforts. But ego replaces those things with distance and silent expectations. It turns simple communication into something that feels risky or strategic rather than natural. In many situations, the silence between two people is not proof that the feelings have disappeared. Sometimes it simply shows that both individuals are protecting their pride at the same time. They may care, they may think about each other often, but neither wants to be the one who moves first. And because of that, the relationship stays frozen in a moment that could have easily been changed by one honest step forward. Another important reason why both people stop reaching out is emotional uncertainty. When feelings become unclear, people often respond by stepping back rather than moving closer. It's a natural reaction. When someone isn't completely sure where they stand in another person's life, the fear of being misunderstood or rejected can make silence feel safer than communication. At the beginning of many connections, communication flows easily because there is excitement and curiosity. Both people feel encouraged to reach out because they sense interest from the other side. But as the relationship progresses, situations can arise that create doubt. Maybe a message was answered with less enthusiasm than before. Maybe plans were postponed or attention seemed to shift. These small moments can plant seeds of uncertainty that slowly grow in someone's mind. Once uncertainty appears, people start analyzing everything more carefully. They begin asking themselves questions like, do they really like me? Or am I the only one putting in effort? Instead of directly asking the other person for clarity, many choose to step back and observe. They reduce how often they reach out, hoping the other person will show initiative and provide reassurance through their actions. But emotional uncertainty can easily create a cycle of silence. When one person pulls back slightly to test the connection, the other person may notice that distance and interpret it as a loss of interest. In response, they also step back to protect their own feelings. What began as one person's uncertainty soon becomes mutual hesitation. The difficult part about uncertainty is that both individuals may still care about each other. Their silence does not always reflect a lack of feeling. Instead, it reflects confusion about whether those feelings are shared. Each person may be waiting for a sign that it is safe to continue investing emotionally. Without that reassurance, they hesitate to take the next step. This is why uncertainty often replaces open communication with quiet observation. Instead of expressing what they feel, people start studying each other's behavior for clues. They pay attention to response times, the tone of messages, or who initiates conversations. These details become signals that they try to interpret in order to understand the relationship. Relying only on interpretation can create misunderstandings. A delayed message might simply mean someone was busy, but the other person may interpret it as emotional distance. A short reply might be written during a stressful day, yet it may be read as disinterest. Because the uncertainty already exists, people often assume the worst possible explanation. This pattern weakens communication. Both people become cautious with their energy. They avoid reaching out too much because they don't want to appear overly invested if the other person isn't equally interested. What once felt like a natural connection begins to feel uncertain and fragile. In many cases, the silence that grows between two people is simply the result of this shared hesitation. Both are unsure, both are protecting themselves, and both are waiting for clarity. Yet the clarity they are hoping for often requires exactly what they are avoiding: honest communication. Without it, uncertainty continues to grow, and the relationship slowly drifts into a quiet distance that neither person originally intended. When both people stop reaching out, it often signals that the relationship has arrived at a quiet but important crossroads. This is the point where the connection can either move forward with renewed effort or slowly fade into distance. It may not feel dramatic in the moment. There are no arguments, no clear ending, and no direct conversation about what is happening. Instead, there is simply silence. But that silence represents a moment where the future of the connection is quietly being decided. Relationships rarely disappear overnight. More often, they change through small shifts in communication and effort. When both people stop initiating contact, it usually means the dynamic has reached a point where something must change. Either one person will decide that the connection matters enough to step forward again, or both will continue allowing the distance to grow. At this stage, the silence becomes a kind of turning point. If someone reaches out, it can reopen the door to conversation, understanding, and emotional reconnection. Sometimes all it takes is a simple message to break the tension and remind both people of the connection they once shared. That small action can shift the entire direction of the relationship. But if the silence continues, something else begins to happen. The connection gradually loses its momentum. Relationships rely on consistent interaction to stay alive. Without communication, even strong feelings can begin to weaken because there is no space for them to be expressed. Time fills the gap where conversation used to exist, and the emotional closeness that once felt natural slowly becomes unfamiliar. This moment is also revealing because it shows how both people respond when effort is required. In the early stages of a connection, reaching out feels easy because excitement and curiosity are strong. But at a crossroads, the situation is different. Someone must choose whether the relationship is worth stepping beyond hesitation, pride, or fear. Sometimes the silence reveals that both people were waiting for the other to carry the connection forward. When neither does, the relationship simply pauses in place. Over time, that pause can start to feel like an ending, even though no one officially said goodbye. There are also moments when the crossroads highlights a deeper truth about compatibility. If both individuals allow the silence to continue without trying to reconnect, it may show that the emotional investment was not strong enough to overcome hesitation. While this realization can feel disappointing, it can also provide clarity about the true strength of the bond. What makes this stage so powerful is that it removes distractions. When constant messages and conversations disappear, the connection is revealed in its most honest form. The question becomes simple. Will someone choose to keep the relationship alive, or will both allow it to fade? In many ways, this quiet crossroads is one of the most honest moments in any relationship. Without arguments, explanations, or dramatic endings, it shows what happens when effort stops and time begins to take its place. And the direction that follows often determines whether the connection becomes stronger again or simply. What happens after both people stop reaching out often becomes the most important part of the entire situation. The silence itself is only a moment, but the decisions that follow determine whether the relationship fades away or finds a way to grow again. This is why the period after mutual silence carries so much meaning. It reveals how each person truly responds when the connection is no longer moving automatically. In many relationships, communication continues simply because it has become a habit. Messages are exchanged daily, conversations flow naturally, and both people remain connected through routine interaction. But when that routine suddenly stops, the relationship enters a different phase. Now, communication requires a conscious choice rather than a comfortable pattern. At this point, each person is faced with a quiet decision. They can choose to reach out and reopen the connection, or they can allow the silence to continue. Neither option is always easy. Reaching out may feel vulnerable because it involves the risk of not receiving the response they hoped for. On the other hand, remaining silent might feel safer in the moment, but can slowly allow the relationship to disappear without clarity. This stage often reveals the level of emotional investment that exists between two people. Someone who values the connection deeply may eventually decide that breaking the silence is worth the discomfort. They may send a simple message, ask how the other person is doing, or start a conversation that brings the connection back to life. That single step can shift everything because it shows willingness to move past hesitation and prioritize the relationship. If both people continue to remain silent, the relationship begins to change in another way. The absence of communication slowly becomes the new normal. Days turn into weeks, and what once felt like a temporary pause starts to feel permanent. The emotional closeness that existed before becomes harder to rebuild because time has created distance between both individuals. In some situations, this continued silence reveals that the connection was not as strong as it once appeared. Sometimes relationships depend heavily on one person's effort to keep communication alive. When that effort stops, the dynamic becomes clear. If the other person does not step forward to fill that space, it may show that the relationship was not equally supported. At the same time, the outcome of silence does not always mean the feelings were never real. Sometimes both individuals care, but neither feels confident enough to make the first move. They may assume the other person has already lost interest, even if that assumption is not true. Because of this misunderstanding, the connection quietly disappears without either person fully understanding what happened. This is why the way people respond after mutual silence is so important. It reveals their priorities, their courage to communicate, and their willingness to invest emotionally. One small action can revive a connection that seemed to be fading, while continued silence can slowly close the door on something that once felt meaningful. The future of the relationship is rarely decided by the silence itself. It is decided by what each person chooses to do after that silence appears. When both people stop reaching out, the silence can feel heavy, confusing, and even painful. But it is rarely meaningless. It carries messages about hesitation, pride, emotional uncertainty, and the true balance of effort in the relationship. Silence exposes what each person is willing or not willing to do, revealing the real state of the connection without any words. The key truth is that relationships do not thrive on assumptions or silent standoffs. They grow through communication, clarity, and the courage to take emotional risks. How each person responds to the quiet, whether they reach out, step back further, or allow the distance to grow, ultimately determines the path forward. Silence is not necessarily an ending, It is information. It tells you what matters, what is being tested, and what requires action. And sometimes breaking the silence is the only way to discover whether a connection is truly meant to continue or quietly fade away.